why your kindness makes people disrespect you. The misunderstanding of kindness, when offered without discernment, is often mistaken for weakness. People assume that because you are kind, you are unwilling to stand firm or make difficult decisions, when in reality true kindness is the highest form of strength. The temptation to exploit it is a sad truth that those who offer kindness without condition may often become targets for exploitation. The self-interested are quick to take advantage of generosity, expecting the kind-hearted to yield, and in doing so they fail to appreciate the cost of such kindness. The fragility of human nature, we are all prone to seeing what is good in others as an opportunity to diminish them. We do this because in our envy or self-righteousness, we cannot bear the thought of someone else being superior. This is why kindness is often met not with admiration, but with a subtle form of disdain. The fear of vulnerability to be kind is to open oneself to the vulnerability of being hurt. Many, frightened by the idea of such vulnerability, will instead respond with mockery or contempt, thus rejecting the very gift offered. Kindness as a mirror, when kindness is extended, it reflects back upon those it is offered. For some, this reflection is unsettling. It forces them to confront their own lack of compassion. And rather than learning from this, they dismiss the kindness to avoid self-reflection. The role of selfishness, human selfishness, makes kindness appear suspicious. A kind act is often viewed through the lens of what does this person want from me. The expectation of ulterior motives leads to an underestimation of the true nobility behind selfless generosity. The paradox of respect. There is a curious paradox in human behavior. Kindness that should earn respect often earns disdain. Those who wield power or seek it tend to value strength over kindness, mistakenly equating weakness with goodness, and thus fail to show reverence for the gentle. Kindness as a challenge. A truly kind person challenges the status quo. By offering love freely and without judgment, they expose the indifference of others, and that exposure can be uncomfortable. People may, therefore, retaliate by devaluing or disrespecting what they do not understand or fear. The need for boundaries. True kindness is not boundless. It is wise, not indiscriminate. When kindness is given without limits or boundaries, it can be construed as naive, and those who would seek to take advantage of it may feel no obligation to reciprocate with respect. The call to love. In the end, kindness is the call to love, and love is not always easy to accept. Those who are trapped in their own bitterness or disappointment may find kindness an affront to their hardened worldviews. When love is offered, it may be rejected, not because it is unwelcome, but because it forces people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The heart of kindness is not in its reception, but in its offering. And though it may be met with disrespect, the true value of kindness lies not in how others treat it, but in the spirit with which it is given. Kindness, in its purest form, is not the absence of strength, but rather its expression in a form that demands courage. It is easy to mistake gentleness for a lack of resolve, for it is a quality often displayed in the face of aggression or indifference. When we extend kindness, we do so at great personal cost, and it requires a fortitude that many are unwilling to acknowledge. The soft-spoken word of compassion, the gentle touch in times of hardship, are not the acts of someone who lacks backbone, but of someone who has mastered the art of restraint. People, often overwhelmed by their own fears or insecurities, see kindness as an invitation to trample over boundaries. They misinterpret compassion as a sign of submissiveness, assuming that because you do not fight fire with fire, you are incapable of standing your ground. But what they fail to understand is that true kindness requires no justification. It is not a posture of retreat, but one of careful engagement. To be kind is to recognize the value of others, even when their actions seem unworthy of such respect, and to offer grace despite the risk. There is an implicit strength in kindness that many overlook. It is the strength to remain calm when the world rages around you, the strength to offer your hand when others would turn theirs away. It is the strength to see the humanity in others, even when they show none to you. This strength is not built on the desire to avoid conflict, but rather on the courage to engage with it in a manner that holds fast to what is just and true without resorting to the tools of cruelty. When kindness is extended without discernment, it can, unfortunately, invite exploitation. People who lack the wisdom to distinguish between true kindness and weakness will often seek to take advantage of it. They mistake an open hand for an invitation to take more than they give. This is not the fault of the kind person, but a flaw in the perception of those who see only what they wish to see. The weakness they perceive is nothing more than their own inability to understand the depth of generosity. The world too often praises the loud and the brash, those who claim victory through force or dominance. In such an environment, kindness is seen as something to be overcome or manipulated. The kind person, though, does not seek to outdo others in loudness or strength. Instead, they stand firm in their convictions, even when the world whispers that such convictions are weak. Their actions speak louder than any boastful display of power ever could, and it is in the quiet endurance of kindness that true strength resides. Kindness is not a passive virtue, it is a force that demands action. It is not something that exists in a vacuum, waiting to be bestowed upon those who deserve it, but something that actively shapes the world in ways that are often invisible to those who have never chosen to offer it. The gentle act of kindness is, in itself, a declaration of personal fortitude, a declaration that the one offering it has mastered themselves enough to choose love over hate, understanding over judgment, even when faced with those who seek only to harm. Those who mistake kindness for weakness often fail to see the broader picture. They see only the immediate act, not the internal strength it takes to offer that act. True kindness requires the ability to look beyond one's own desires, beyond immediate gratification, and see the long-term benefit in showing mercy and compassion. It requires a discipline of spirit, an ability to choose what is right over what is easy. And this discipline is no small feat. It is, in fact, the highest form of strength. It is natural to be skeptical of what we do not understand. Kindness that is extended without the intent to gain, without the expectation of reward, is a rarity in a world that thrives on transactional relationships. Yet, this very purity of heart is what often leads others to question its authenticity. They believe that all actions must have ulterior motives, that there must be some hidden agenda behind every act of goodwill. They cannot fathom the possibility that kindness might exist simply for the sake of kindness, and so they dismiss it as naive or foolish. To be kind is to walk a path that is often solitary. The majority will not understand, for they are caught in the cycle of self-interest and competition. They will see your gentleness and mistake it for fragility, for they have never seen strength tested in the quiet way that kindness demands. And so they will disrespect it, not realizing that their lack of understanding only highlights the depth of your own character. And yet, those who possess the rare gift of discernment will see kindness for what it truly is, a reflection of strength in its most refined form. It is not an absence of conflict, but a willingness to engage in the hardest struggles of all the struggles within the soul, the struggles of choosing the good over the expedient. It is in this ongoing battle that the truly kind find their strength, and it is this strength that, though often unnoticed by the world, endures longer than any boastful display of power ever could. There is a certain tragedy that accompanies unconditional kindness. Those who give freely, without a thought for what they might gain in return, often find themselves prey to the self-interested, who see such acts of goodness not as gifts but as opportunities. The kind-hearted are too often viewed as weak or gullible, and those with ulterior motives swiftly seize the chance to manipulate or exploit them. The one who extends their hand without expectation finds it grasped not in gratitude but in greed. It is a natural inclination for the selfish to view every open gesture as an invitation to take, and this is a reality that those who seek only to do good must face. The kindness offered without condition is rarely received with equal generosity. Instead, it is seen as something to be consumed, used, and ultimately discarded once it has served its purpose. The true cost of kindness is often invisible to those who benefit from it, who remain blind to the sacrifices made by those who give it. When kindness is extended without discernment, it opens the door to the possibility of being taken advantage of. The kind person, hoping only to ease the burden of others, may find their own burden increased as they become a repository for the demands of those who would exploit them. There is no accounting for how much is given, no acknowledgement of the wear and tear that kindness can bring. To offer such love and care is a costly endeavor, but this cost is too often overlooked by those who benefit from it. The selfish person, for whom nothing is ever given without the expectation of return, sees only what they can extract. They have no sense of the sacrifice inherent in kindness, no understanding of what is given up in the act of generosity. Instead, they assume that those who offer it do so out of abundance, as if kindness were an inexhaustible resource. This misapprehension leads them to exploit the kindness of others without remorse, for they are blind to the toll it takes. It is a painful irony that the very people who could most benefit from kindness are often the ones who fail to see its value. Those who are broken or selfish may find themselves the most eager to accept the kindness of others, but they are also the least likely to reciprocate or appreciate the true cost of what has been given to them. Instead, they take it for granted, assuming that kindness is a constant, a wellspring that never runs dry, and so they continue to take without hesitation. In this dynamic, the kind-hearted person is left vulnerable, not because their kindness is unwise, but because the world is full of those who would use it for their own gain. The very openness and generosity that should inspire gratitude instead becomes the target of exploitation. And yet this should not cause the kind person to withdraw. It should not diminish their desire to give. For the price of kindness is not measured by the takers, but by the giver, and that price is one that the kind-hearted must be willing to pay. The temptation to exploit is most dangerous when it appears subtle. Those who seek to take advantage do not always do so openly. They may cloak their demands in a veil of need, pretending to be helpless or incapable of managing on their own. In this way, they manipulate the kind-hearted into giving more than they should, for they appeal to the innate goodness that resides in those who care for others. It is not an obvious form of exploitation, but one that is sneaky and insidious disguised as dependence. What the self-interested fail to realize in their pursuit of what they can extract is that kindness is not a currency that can be endlessly spent without consequence. Each act of kindness, when taken for granted or exploited, leaves behind a residue, a quiet depletion that is not immediately visible. It is not a resource that can be endlessly drawn from, but a precious offering that, once depleted, can leave the giver drained and barren. Yet, the exploiters fail to see this depletion, for they see only what they can take, not what has been given. The unfortunate truth is that those who are most generous with their kindness are often the least likely to demand their due. They give freely, without expectation, but in doing so they create a power imbalance. The one who gives without question becomes vulnerable to those who take without hesitation. The relationship becomes lopsided, with the giver constantly expected to yield, and the taker never considering the sacrifice they have demanded. In this dynamic, kindness becomes a burden rather than a gift. In the end, kindness without boundaries opens the door to exploitation. The kind-hearted must learn not only to give but to discern when their kindness is being abused. Without this discernment, kindness becomes a weapon that is used against them, not because the world is evil, but because it is indifferent to the cost of what is given. There is a curious and tragic aspect of human nature that drives us to seek out the flaws in others, especially when they exhibit qualities we do not possess ourselves. When we see goodness in another, we instinctively react by devaluing it, not because we are indifferent to its worth, but because we cannot bear the thought of it surpassing our own. This is the subtle ugliness of envy, a poison that distorts our view of others, making us unable to appreciate what is noble in them. Instead of admiring the kindness we see, we diminish it, as if to acknowledge its value would be to admit some deficiency in ourselves. This tendency is not always conscious. It is a reaction born of the fragility within us, the vulnerability we feel when confronted with someone who seems to possess what we lack. The kind-hearted person, who offers compassion without condition, becomes a mirror reflecting our own shortcomings. Rather than being inspired to be more like them, we may feel threatened by their goodness, as if their kindness somehow exposes the cracks in our own character. We cannot bear to allow them to stand as models of what we wish we could be, so we choose instead to undermine them. The more pure and selfless the kindness, the more it exposes the contrast with our own hearts. There is an uncomfortable truth we often seek to avoid, that kindness demands something from us. It calls us to examine ourselves to measure our own capacity for goodness. When we are confronted with someone whose kindness exceeds our own, we often choose to belittle it rather than rise to its challenge. We dismiss it as naive or unrealistic or weak anything to avoid acknowledging the discomfort it brings to our own sense of self-worth. In this way, the truly good and kind are often met with disdain, not because their actions are unworthy, but because they force us to confront the reality of our own inadequacy. It is far easier to dismiss what is good in another than it is to aspire to it. We tell ourselves that their goodness is a facade, a charade, something they use to cover up their own flaws. In doing so, we allow ourselves to feel superior, for we have convinced ourselves that kindness, in its truest form, is a form of weakness, something to be ridiculed rather than respected. There is a deep, unspoken fear that underlies this disdain, a fear that someone else's goodness will somehow make us appear less. This fear is rooted in our insecurity, a fragile sense of self that cannot tolerate comparison with something we perceive as better. The human ego is a delicate thing, and when faced with the strength of kindness, it feels small. The only way to regain a sense of control is to belittle what we cannot attain, to diminish that which reminds us of our own lack. And yet, this response is a tragic misunderstanding of both kindness and human nature. Kindness is not a weapon, nor is it a challenge to our pride. It is a gift, freely given, that calls for no repayment. But in our weakness, we turn it into something to be feared, to be scorned, because it highlights our own deficiencies. The person who offers kindness stands in contrast to the selfishness that so often governs our world, and rather than inspire us to rise above that selfishness, we choose instead to bring them down to our level, to make them as small and flawed as we believe ourselves to be. It is the nature of envy to twist our perception, to take something pure and transform it into something flawed. This is why true kindness is often met not with admiration, but with suspicion. We wonder, is this kindness genuine, or is it a mask? We question the motives behind it, for surely no one could be so selfless without some hidden agenda. And so, instead of acknowledging the goodness in others, we seek to explain it away to make it seem less impressive, less worthy of our respect. This need to diminish what is good in others stems from the fragility of human nature itself. We are creatures of comparison, constantly measuring ourselves against one another. And when faced with someone whose kindness exceeds our own, we are reminded of our own inadequacies. Rather than allow this reminder to inspire us to grow, we react with defensiveness, dismissing the kindness of others as something less than it is. In doing so, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to learn from it, to let it soften our hearts and expand our capacity for goodness. The more we insist on diminishing the kindness we see, the more we close ourselves off from its transformative power. For true kindness, the kind that is untainted by self-interest, is capable of changing hearts. But only if those hearts are willing to receive it, to admit that they are not as good as they might wish to be, and that the goodness of others is something to be emulated, not feared. Until we are able to set aside our pride and envy, we will continue to meet kindness with disdain, rejecting the very thing that could heal us. Kindness, in its truest sense, is an act of profound vulnerability. To extend kindness is to expose one's heart, to offer it openly without any guarantee that it will be received in the same spirit. This exposure carries with it the risk of pain, for the kind-hearted person places themselves in a position where they can be rejected, misunderstood, or even taken advantage of. It is a delicate and brave thing to offer something as pure as kindness, knowing full well that it may not be reciprocated, and may even be met with disdain or mockery. The fear of vulnerability is deeply embedded in the human condition. We are instinctively protective of our hearts, and so the idea of offering kindness, of lowering our defenses, is a frightening prospect. To be kind is to open oneself to the possibility of hurt, to offer something of ourselves that can easily be dismissed or scorned. It is far safer to remain closed off, to shield ourselves from the pain of rejection, than to risk exposure in the hope that kindness will be met with appreciation. This is why so many choose not to be kind, not because they lack the capacity, but because they fear the wounds that might come from such openness. The vulnerable person, offering kindness freely, is in a sense putting their very soul on display, and this display can often evoke discomfort in others. The self-protective instincts of those who are fearful of being hurt themselves often manifest as mockery or contempt. Rather than acknowledging the courage it takes to be kind, they dismiss it as naive, foolish, or weak. They cannot bear to see someone else be vulnerable without feeling compelled to diminish it, as if doing so would somehow shield them from the possibility of their own vulnerability. This reaction is rooted in the fear that kindness is a form of surrender. To offer kindness, to be open and generous, is to surrender control. It is to say, "Here I am in all my humanity, offering you a part of myself." The person who responds with mockery or scorn does so not because they are incapable of kindness, but because they cannot bear the vulnerability that kindness demands. They hide behind a facade of cynicism or disdain, unwilling to expose their own vulnerability for fear that it will be used against them. Vulnerability, however, is not a weakness, it is the very essence of strength. To be vulnerable is to recognize that we are not impervious to the world, that we are open to being affected by it. And yet, this is the paradox: those who are brave enough to be vulnerable often suffer the most. Kindness, by its nature, invites vulnerability, and with it, the possibility of being hurt. But this is not a reason to retreat into self-protection. For it is in this very vulnerability that the power of kindness lies. It is easy to mock what we do not understand, and this is especially true when it comes to kindness. The person who offers kindness without condition appears, to the fearful eye, to be too open, too unguarded, too willing to give. They seem to expose themselves to the very dangers they wish to avoid. This fear of being hurt, this reluctance to be vulnerable, leads others to reject kindness outright, as if by mocking it, they can somehow insulate themselves from the risk of experiencing the same. But in doing so, they miss the deeper lesson that kindness teaches. In truth, kindness is the opposite of weakness. It is the ability to stand firm in the face of the very vulnerabilities we try to avoid. The kind-hearted person does not pretend to be invincible, rather, they embrace the possibility of hurt, knowing that it is part of the human experience. To be kind is to embrace the fullness of life, with all its joys and sorrows, its highs and lows. It is an act of courage, not because it is easy, but because it involves the willingness to be vulnerable, to give without the guarantee of return. But for those who fear vulnerability, kindness appears as an invitation to weakness, an opening for others to take advantage. The act of giving, when unprotected by walls of cynicism or self-interest, seems like an invitation to be hurt, and this is why so many reject it. They cannot bear the thought of laying themselves bare in the way that kindness requires, so they dismiss it as naive or foolish. They do not see that by rejecting kindness, they are rejecting the very possibility of connection, of opening themselves up to the transformative power that kindness has to offer. This fear of vulnerability, of opening oneself to the world in a way that invites both love and pain, is the great barrier that prevents us from fully embracing kindness. It is the reason why so many are reluctant to give, and why so many who do give are met with scorn rather than gratitude. For to be kind is to be vulnerable, and for many that vulnerability is simply too great a risk to take. But it is in this very act of vulnerability that the strength of kindness is revealed, for to give of oneself without fear or reservation is the highest expression of human courage. Kindness, when offered with sincerity, serves as a mirror to those who receive it. It reflects not just the goodness of the one who extends it, but the state of the heart of the person on the receiving end. In this reflection, some are confronted with a reality they would rather avoid: their own lack of compassion, their inability to offer what has been freely given to them. This confrontation is unsettling, for it lays bare the gaps between their actions and the ideal of kindness that they may aspire to but are reluctant to embrace. Rather than welcoming this opportunity for growth, they dismiss it, pushing it away as a defense against the discomfort it brings. The mirror of kindness is not always a flattering one. When we are shown kindness by another, it often highlights the areas in which we are deficient. It calls attention to our own selfishness, our own inability to extend grace or compassion to others. For many, this revelation is painful. It exposes the fragile, imperfect parts of themselves they would rather keep hidden, and so instead of facing it, they turn away. They mock the kindness, dismiss it as superficial or naive, anything to avoid the uncomfortable truth that their own hearts are not as open or generous as they might wish. In this way, kindness becomes a challenge. It is not merely a gift, it is a mirror that forces those who encounter it to reflect upon their own capacity for goodness. For those whose hearts are hardened or whose lives are consumed with self-interest, this reflection is too much to bear. It becomes easier to devalue the kindness than to face the reality that they are not as kind as they should be. They see the goodness of others not as a guide to emulate, but as a reminder of their own shortcomings. To admit this would require vulnerability, a willingness to grow, and many are unwilling to do so. The kindness extended to another asks them to measure themselves against something greater than their own desires, greater than their own needs. It forces them to acknowledge that kindness is not a limited resource, not something that can only be shared with those we deem deserving, but a quality that is meant to flow freely, without discrimination or calculation. When faced with this truth, some choose instead to reject the kindness outright, to diminish it, to make it appear smaller or less significant than it truly is, for doing so allows them to avoid the challenge it presents. This refusal to accept kindness is a form of self-protection. If they can dismiss the kindness, they can avoid facing the question of why they are not as kind, why they do not give as freely or as generously. In this way, kindness becomes something to be feared, not because it is harmful, but because it holds up a mirror to the one who receives it, forcing them to see themselves as they truly are. And for many, this is too painful a thing to confront. The irony is that in rejecting kindness, they miss the very opportunity that could lead them to greater self-awareness. Kindness, if accepted in its fullness, has the power to transform. It holds up a vision of what is possible when we choose to live with an open heart, free of selfishness and fear. But when we refuse to look into the mirror it offers, we remain blind to our own potential for growth. Instead of embracing the possibility of change, we close ourselves off, retreating into the comfort of our own familiar patterns. For some, the reflection kindness offers is so stark that it becomes an insurmountable obstacle. They cannot bear the thought of confronting the ways in which they fall short, so they dismiss the kindness, ridiculing it or belittling it in an attempt to maintain their own sense of superiority. By doing so, they avoid the deeper work of self-reflection, the work that would lead them to greater compassion and understanding. The mirror of kindness is a mirror of truth, and truth is something that many would rather ignore than face. But kindness, when offered freely, cannot be hidden or obscured. It remains a constant reminder, an invitation to become better, to live more fully in alignment with the values we claim to hold dear. The reflection it provides, though uncomfortable, is not meant to condemn but to inspire, not to shame but to encourage. It shows us not only who we are, but who we could be, if we chose to live with the same openness, generosity, and grace that we so often withhold from others. In the end, kindness calls us to rise above our own limitations, to see ourselves not in isolation, but in relation to others. It shows us the power of connection, the strength found in giving freely, without expecting anything in return. Those who are willing to embrace the reflection of kindness are the ones who will grow, who will find within themselves the capacity to love more deeply, to care more genuinely, and to act with greater compassion. But to do so, they must first face the mirror, and this is something that many are unwilling to do. In a world that is often governed by self-interest, kindness can appear as an anomaly, an act that seems too good to be true. Human selfishness, which colors so much of our interactions, leads us to view any act of kindness through the lens of suspicion. We are quick to ask, what does this person want from me, rather than accepting kindness for what it is, a simple offering of goodwill without expectation of return. The prevalence of ulterior motives in human relationships makes it difficult to trust the purity of kindness. We have become conditioned to believe that every gesture has a hidden agenda, that every act of generosity must be tied to some form of self-interest, no matter how subtle or concealed. This suspicion stems from a deep-seated mistrust of the motives of others. In a society where self-preservation is often paramount, it is hard to accept that anyone would act without some expectation of benefit. We look for signs of manipulation or self-serving interests in the kind acts of others, assuming that behind every smile or gesture lies a demand. To believe that someone is kind for the sake of kindness, without any ulterior motive, is to challenge the deeply ingrained assumption that every human action is driven by a desire for personal gain. This skepticism leads to a profound underestimation of the true nobility behind selfless generosity. Selfishness has a way of distorting our perceptions of others. When we are motivated by our own desires, we naturally project that same mindset onto others. We expect that others too must be driven by their own needs, their own desires for recognition, validation, or advantage. This projection leads us to dismiss acts of kindness as calculated moves, carefully designed to elicit something in return. We fail to see the inherent goodness in the act itself, and instead we reduce it to a mere transaction, something to be bargained over or negotiated. Moreover, the idea of true selflessness is a difficult one for the selfish heart to comprehend. Self-interest is so deeply woven into the fabric of human nature that we often struggle to recognize acts of kindness that are not driven by personal benefit. We assume that there must always be something behind the kindness, some hidden desire, because it is almost impossible for us to imagine that someone could give freely without wanting anything in return. This leads to a distortion of kindness, reducing it to something transactional rather than transformative. The expectation of ulterior motives in kindness also creates a barrier to receiving it. When we are convinced that there is always a hidden agenda, we are less likely to accept kindness with an open heart. We become wary, hesitant, and suspicious, wondering what is being asked of us in exchange for the gesture. This wariness robs us of the opportunity to experience the true beauty of kindness, to be touched by the selflessness behind it. Instead of allowing kindness to warm and soften our hearts, we close ourselves off, fearful that we are being taken advantage of. This suspicion also breeds a reluctance to offer kindness. When we expect that every act of kindness will be met with suspicion, we may hesitate to extend our hand to others. We fear that our motives will be questioned, that our intentions will be misunderstood, and that our kindness will be seen as self-serving rather than genuine. The very fear of being misjudged can prevent us from sharing the best of ourselves, from offering the gift of kindness without reservation. And in doing so, we perpetuate the cycle of selfishness, where every act of goodwill is seen through the lens of personal gain. Yet, the nobility of kindness is precisely that it exists without the expectation of return. To offer kindness without seeking anything in exchange is to rise above the transactional nature of human interaction. It is an act that speaks to the very best of human nature, to the possibility of love and generosity in a world that often operates on the basis of reciprocity. But in a culture steeped in selfishness, this kind of generosity is often overlooked, misunderstood, or dismissed as naive. We fail to recognize that true kindness is not about what is received, but about what is freely given, regardless of the outcome. When we view kindness through the lens of selfishness, we miss the opportunity to experience the deep, transformative power that selfless generosity can bring. We fail to see that kindness, when offered purely, is a gift that enriches both the giver and the receiver, not because of any tangible return, but because of the connection it fosters between people. It is a reminder that there is goodness in the world, that not all actions are motivated by self-interest, and that there is a nobility in giving without expecting anything in return. But this requires us to overcome our natural inclination to view kindness as a transaction, to let go of the assumption that every act of generosity has an ulterior motive. The challenge, then, is to recognize the true nobility of kindness in a world that often sees it as a form of currency. If we can learn to accept kindness without suspicion, to give it freely without expectation, and to receive it with gratitude rather than doubt, we can begin to break free from the constraints of selfishness and experience the true power of selfless generosity. Until we do, however, kindness will continue to be misunderstood, dismissed, and underestimated, not for its lack of value, but because we are unable to see beyond the lens of our own selfishness. There is an odd paradox in the way human beings regard kindness, one that seems to defy all logic. In a world where respect is often equated with power and dominance, kindness, the very trait that should command reverence, frequently earns disdain. This paradox becomes evident when we observe those who hold power or are striving for it. They tend to place a higher value on strength, on assertiveness, and on the ability to exert control over others. Kindness, in their eyes, becomes synonymous with weakness. It is seen as something soft, something passive, an attribute unworthy of admiration, let alone respect. This view of kindness is rooted in a deep misunderstanding of what true strength actually is. To possess power in the traditional sense, be it political, social, or economic, often requires the ability to manipulate, to dominate, to assert one's will over others. The powerful, therefore, come to equate strength with the ability to bend the world to their desires. Kindness, in this context, appears as a vulnerability, a yielding of control, and thus is mistaken for a lack of resolve or capacity. The paradox lies in the fact that kindness, in its truest form, requires far more strength than many realize. It is not the absence of power, but the mastery of it, the choice to use one's influence not to control, but to uplift. In the eyes of those who value power above all, kindness can appear as a form of submission. The idea that someone could choose to act with gentleness, to offer grace and understanding without seeking something in return, strikes them as naive or ineffective. They fail to recognize that the ability to remain kind in the face of adversity, to offer compassion in a world that often seems indifferent to it, requires immense strength of character. The kind-hearted person, far from being weak, has chosen to rise above the pettiness and cruelty of the world, to act according to a higher standard that does not depend on domination or control. This failure to recognize the true strength in kindness results in a lack of respect for those who embody it. The world often rewards those who pursue power relentlessly, who fight for their place at the top with ruthlessness and determination. Those who wield power with an iron fist are frequently admired for their decisiveness and their ability to impose their will. Meanwhile, the kind-hearted person who wields their influence with humility and compassion may be dismissed as ineffective, as someone who lacks the toughness required to succeed in a world driven by competition and survival. The paradox deepens when we consider that, in reality, those who live by kindness often have a profound, quiet power that those who seek to control the world may never know. They are able to inspire loyalty and trust in a way that force cannot. They have the ability to unite, to heal, and to create lasting bonds between individuals, even in the face of deep divisions. Yet, because their power does not manifest in the form of dominance, it is often overlooked or undervalued. The respect they deserve is withheld, not because they lack merit, but because their power is not the kind that is immediately visible or easy to quantify. This failure to honor the gentle, the compassionate, and the kind is rooted in a deeper cultural bias, the belief that the strongest are those who can impose their will on others, rather than those who can lift others up with humility and love. The very nature of power, as we understand it, often precludes the recognition of kindness as a form of strength. We have come to associate power with conflict, with competition, and with the ability to triumph over others. Kindness, on the other hand, is associated with harmony, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence qualities that are often undervalued in a world that prizes achievement and conquest. Yet the true paradox is that while the world may dismiss kindness as weak or ineffective, history has shown that those who lead with compassion and gentleness leave a far deeper and more enduring mark than those who lead with force. The most revered figures in human history, those who have made the greatest positive impact on the world, are often those who have chosen kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, humility over pride. They have shown us that true strength lies not in the ability to dominate, but in the ability to serve, to uplift, and to remain steadfast in the face of adversity with a heart full of compassion. The respect that kindness deserves, then, is not the respect that comes from power, but the respect that comes from wisdom, the wisdom to recognize that true strength is not always loud or imposing, but often quiet and humble. Those who wield power or seek it would do well to remember that kindness is not a sign of weakness but of courage, not an absence of strength but a different form of it. Until this is understood, the paradox will remain kindness, which should earn respect, will continue to be met with disdain. A truly kind person does not merely conform to the norms of society, they challenge them. By offering love freely without judgment or expectation, they stand in stark contrast to the prevailing attitudes of indifference, cynicism, and self-interest that so often dominate human behavior. In a world where kindness is often transactional, where every gesture is measured by what can be gained in return, the unguarded generosity of a kind heart can be deeply unsettling. It exposes the deep flaws and contradictions in the way society operates. It forces others to confront the uncomfortable reality that they too could act with greater compassion but have chosen not to. And this exposure is something many find difficult to bear. People uncomfortable with the challenge that kindness presents may react with hostility or disdain. They may mock, belittle, or devalue the kind person, not because they are inherently cruel, but because they fear the implications of such unconditional love. To witness someone living out their kindness so freely is to be reminded of one's own failures to do the same, and this reminder often sparks resentment. It exposes their own indifference, their own selfishness, and the defensive walls they have built to shield themselves from the vulnerability that kindness demands. Rather than acknowledge this truth, they may instead retaliate by dismissing the kindness as naive or foolish, as if doing so would absolve them of the discomfort it causes. This retaliation is rooted in fear that by embracing kindness, they would be forced to reevaluate their own lives, to consider what they are withholding from the world, and to recognize the ways in which they too could be better. A kind person, by simply being who they are, challenges the very foundations of how we engage with one another. They embody a love that expects nothing in return, a generosity that does not measure the worth of others by what they can offer. In doing so, they become a living critique of the world's more transactional approach to relationships. This can be threatening to those who have built their lives around the idea of self-preservation, of giving only when there is something to gain. Moreover, kindness exposes the masks that people wear. It strips away the layers of defensiveness, the walls erected to protect one's own sense of self-worth. When faced with someone who offers love without any expectation of reciprocation, those who are not willing to embrace such openness may feel vulnerable, exposed. They may realize that their own sense of security, their sense of being in control, is based on a foundation of withholding, of keeping others at arm's length. This is where the challenge lies. Kindness, by its very nature, demands vulnerability, and those who are unwilling to be vulnerable often respond with fear and retaliation. The kind-hearted person does not simply passively accept the world as it is. They take an active stance by offering what so many others are reluctant to give: love, compassion, understanding. In doing so, they demonstrate that there is another way to live, another way to interact with the world, one that does not prioritize self-interest or power, but rather seeks to uplift others, to meet them where they are with acceptance and care. This act in itself challenges the status quo, and as with all challenges, it is met with resistance. The world often does not want to change. It prefers to remain in its comfortable patterns, to operate according to familiar rules. Kindness disrupts these patterns, and in doing so, it invites discomfort, uncertainty, and at times hostility. But the very discomfort that kindness provokes is a testament to its power. It shows that kindness is not a passive, easily ignored trait. It is an active force that compels a response. To offer kindness is to refuse to conform to a world that values self-interest above all else. It is to insist, through actions and words, that there is a different way to live, one that prioritizes human connection, empathy, and compassion. This challenge may not always be welcomed, and the kind person may find themselves marginalized, disrespected, or misunderstood. But in the end, it is the very act of challenging the status quo that has the potential to bring about the most profound change. Kindness, therefore, is not merely a passive virtue, it is a radical act of resistance. It challenges the norms of a world that values toughness, independence, and self-reliance above all else. It stands as a quiet protest against a culture that rewards those who are willing to trample on others to get ahead. And in doing so, it offers a vision of a different kind of world, a world where people are valued for who they are, not what they can offer in return. This vision is uncomfortable for many, for it calls into question everything they have been taught to value. It exposes the hollowness of a life lived in pursuit of power, and in doing so, it invites the possibility of something better. Yet, because it challenges so much, it is often met with resistance and fear. The very kindness that seeks to heal and transform the world is, paradoxically often the very thing that others seek to reject or dismiss. True kindness, though generous and abundant, is not without limits. It is often said that kindness should have no boundaries, that it should be offered freely, without hesitation or restriction. But in practice, this view of kindness can be dangerous, for it overlooks the wisdom that lies in discernment. Kindness, when given without consideration for the context or the needs of the giver, can quickly devolve into a naive and indiscriminate gesture. It becomes something that is easily taken for granted, something that others may come to expect without any sense of responsibility to reciprocate or even to respect it. Boundaries, in the context of kindness, are not a denial of generosity, but a recognition that true kindness must be wise and purposeful. It is not enough to offer kindness simply because it feels good or because it is expected. Rather, kindness must be given thoughtfully, with an awareness of its impact and its place within the greater fabric of human relationships. Without boundaries, kindness risks being misinterpreted, even exploited. Those who receive kindness without any apparent limits may begin to take it for granted, assuming that it will always be available to them, no matter the cost to the giver. When kindness is extended without boundaries, it can create an unhealthy dynamic. It sets an unrealistic expectation that kindness is limitless, and thus others may feel no obligation to respond with anything other than what they have already received. The absence of boundaries leads to a one-sided relationship where one person gives endlessly, while the other takes without pause. This dynamic can be exhausting, and eventually the person offering kindness may find themselves drained, resentful, and disillusioned. They may feel that their generosity is not valued or appreciated, that their kindness has been taken for granted, and they may withdraw or become bitter. Boundaries are not walls to keep others out, but safeguards that preserve the integrity of kindness. They serve as a way of protecting both the giver and the receiver, ensuring that kindness is shared in a way that is sustainable and mutually respectful. When we offer kindness with an understanding of its limits, we allow others to appreciate its value. We show them that kindness is not a commodity to be consumed, but a gift that must be cherished and reciprocated in a way that maintains balance and mutual respect. By setting boundaries, we communicate that kindness is not infinite, that it cannot be exploited without consequences, and that it must be given and received with care. Furthermore, boundaries also prevent kindness from being perceived as weakness. When we set limits on how much we give, we signal that kindness is a choice, not an obligation. It is an act of strength, not one of submission. This understanding fosters respect, as others recognize that kindness is not something to be taken for granted, but something to be valued and honored. Without boundaries, kindness can become a tool for manipulation, a means for others to exploit the giver's generosity for their own gain. But with boundaries in place, kindness becomes a conscious and deliberate act, one that holds its value and integrity intact. The idea that kindness should be boundless often comes from a place of idealism, a desire to see the world transformed by unconditional love. However, the reality is that without limits, kindness can lose its potency. It becomes diluted, and the very essence of what makes it special, its sincerity and its ability to heal, becomes compromised. Kindness must be purposeful, measured, and aligned with a sense of self-respect. Only then can it maintain its dignity and its power to make a meaningful difference in the lives of others. In relationships, kindness without boundaries can lead to imbalances of power, with one person continually giving while the other takes without reciprocation. The giver may begin to feel unappreciated or exploited, while the receiver may become accustomed to the endless generosity, with no sense of obligation to give anything in return. This imbalance can foster resentment and frustration, as the kindness that was once freely offered becomes a source of emotional depletion rather than mutual growth. By setting boundaries, the giver ensures that kindness is exchanged on equal terms, where both parties contribute to the relationship in meaningful ways. Thus, kindness, though a powerful force, must be tempered with wisdom and discernment. It cannot be blindly given, nor can it be offered without thought to the consequences. Boundaries are the framework within which kindness can flourish, ensuring that it is both sustainable and respectful. The most genuine acts of kindness are those that are given thoughtfully, with a clear understanding of when and how much to offer, and with an awareness that kindness, like all things, is most effective when it is given in balance. When we fail to set boundaries, we risk allowing kindness to become something that is undervalued, taken for granted, and eventually exhausted. But when we offer kindness with discernment, we ensure that it remains a force for good, one that can uplift and enrich both the giver and the receiver. At its core, kindness is not merely an action, it is a call to love. Love, in its truest form, is an invitation to break down barriers, to transcend the limitations of self-interest, and to embrace the vulnerability of connecting with others in a way that is both deep and unguarded. Yet, love is not always easy to accept. For many it is a challenge, even a threat, to their carefully constructed walls of bitterness and disappointment. These walls, built over years of hurt and disillusionment, provide a false sense of security. They shield the heart from the pain of vulnerability, offering a protective shell that shields one from the sting of rejection or loss. When love is offered, it calls upon individuals to dismantle these defenses and face the rawness of their own humanity. This is where the difficulty lies. Love, in its purest form, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. To accept love requires a willingness to look inward, to recognize the places where we have hardened, where we have allowed our bitterness to take root, and where we have closed ourselves off from the world around us. Kindness, as an expression of love, becomes a mirror, reflecting back to us the parts of ourselves we would rather ignore. It holds up a mirror to our pride, our insecurities, our fears, and our wounds. For those trapped in their own hurt, this mirror can be difficult to face. It exposes the very things they have spent years trying to avoid or suppress. It is in this exposure that love often meets with rejection, not because it is unwelcome, but because it demands something from those who receive it. To accept love is to acknowledge that we are not as invulnerable as we may have believed, to admit that we need others, and that we are not self-sufficient. This admission can be deeply uncomfortable, especially for those who have been hurt or disappointed by others in the past. The pain of past wounds, the bitterness of unhealed scars, makes the vulnerability required by love feel like a risk too great to take. For some, it is easier to reject love than to face the discomfort of confronting their own brokenness. The call to love, then, is not an easy one. It does not come with guarantees of acceptance or gratitude. It often requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to continue offering love even when it is not reciprocated. This is especially true when kindness is met with resistance, when it is rejected not because of its lack of merit, but because it forces a confrontation with a worldview that has been hardened by disappointment. Those who are entrenched in their own pain may find kindness to be a disruption, a challenge to their sense of self-protection. The very act of being kind can expose the fault lines in their worldview, revealing that their bitterness, their fear, and their resistance to love are the very things that keep them isolated and alone. This is the paradox of love. It is often rejected by those who need it most. Love does not seek to impose itself upon others, it simply extends an invitation, a gesture of goodwill, a hand reached out in compassion. But for those who are trapped in their own narratives of hurt, this gesture can feel like an accusation, a reminder of everything they have failed to heal. Rather than embracing love as the gift it is, they may recoil from it, believing that to accept it would be to admit weakness, to expose their vulnerabilities, or to confront their own unresolved issues. However, the very act of rejecting love is itself a testament to its power. For even in its rejection, love remains a force that continues to shape and transform. Though it may not always be accepted immediately, the call to love endures, offering an opportunity for healing and change. Those who reject it may do so out of fear or pain, but love does not disappear because it is turned away. It lingers quietly, persistently, waiting for the moment when the walls of bitterness and disappointment will fall, when the heart will be ready to receive the gift of kindness once more. Ultimately, the call to love is not about forcing others to accept what they are not ready for. It is about offering the gift of kindness without reservation, knowing that it may not always be welcomed in the moment, but trusting that it will have its impact over time. It is a reminder that love is not a transaction, not something to be given only when it is accepted, but something that exists independently of the response it receives. The offer of love, even when rejected, remains a powerful force, challenging the worldviews that keep people trapped in their own bitterness and opening the door to the possibility of healing and transformation. In the end, it is clear that kindness, when extended without discernment, often brings more discomfort than comfort. This discomfort arises not from any inherent flaw in kindness itself, but from the way it exposes the hardness of the world around us. When you choose to act with genuine compassion, you shine a light on the self-interest, indifference, and fear that so many others carry. Rather than acknowledging this light, people often recoil from it, not because they despise the light itself, but because it forces them to confront their own shadows. The kindness you offer, then, is not always met with gratitude, but with a resistance born of human pride and insecurity. What is most disturbing about this is that the world, so often preoccupied with strength, misinterprets kindness as a lack of it. The belief that power is to be found in force, rather than in gentleness, causes many to see your kindness as weakness. They mistake your refusal to engage in the same cruelty and competition as a failure to stand firm. They cannot fathom that true strength lies in the ability to remain gentle, to offer love without demanding anything in return. It is easier, then, for them to disrespect you than to admit that they are the ones who do not fully grasp the nature of strength and virtue. Moreover, your kindness threatens the carefully constructed defenses of those who have been hurt, who have chosen bitterness as a shield against a world they perceive as unkind. For these individuals, kindness becomes a reminder of all they have lost and all they have refused to heal. Instead of seeing your kindness as a balm, they see it as an intrusion into their carefully guarded worldviews, one that demands vulnerability and forces them to confront their own brokenness. This kind of confrontation is uncomfortable, and rather than face it, they may respond with contempt, as a way to preserve the illusion that their worldview is invulnerable to change. The truth is that kindness, by its very nature, calls for a level of openness that many are unwilling to offer. It is an invitation to love and to live differently, to reject the harshness and coldness that seem to govern so much of the world. But love is not always easily accepted. When you offer it, you are not simply giving something away, you are asking others to change, to let down their guard, to risk feeling what they have spent so much of their lives avoiding. It is no wonder, then, that so many choose to disrespect you rather than accept the challenge your kindness presents. To accept it would require them to change in ways they are not prepared to. Yet, despite the disrespect, despite the misunderstandings, the call to kindness remains. You may find that those who disrespect you for your kindness are also the ones who need it the most. Their resistance is not a rejection of your heart, but a reflection of their own fears and insecurities. To continue to offer kindness, even in the face of disrespect, is to embody a truth far greater than the superficial judgments of others. It is to act with courage, to persist in love even when it is misunderstood, and to believe that, in the end, kindness is never wasted, but will, in its own quiet way, transform the world.